What I'm about to tell you will make you question how well you really know your neighbors. Because for years, in a small apartment building in Hamburg, Germany, people lived their normal lives. They complained about strange smells. They heard odd noises at night. They passed one man in the hallway, awkward, quiet, unremarkable. And just above their heads, in the darkness of an attic crawl space, were the remains of 4 women. This is the story of Fritz Honka, but more importantly, this is the story of Gertrude, Anna, Frida, and Ruth. 4 women whose lives mattered, whose deaths went unnoticed, and whose killer hid in plain sight for half a decade. And I'm going to tell you exactly how he got away with it for so long. But real quick, if true crime stories that honor the victims and expose uncomfortable truths about society matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Here's why. 90% of people who...
December 1970, Hamburg, Germany. Now, before we dive into what happened, you need to understand something about this time and place. Hamburg's St. Pauli district wasn't like the tourist destination you might visit today. This was raw. This was rough. This was where people who had fallen through society's cracks ended up. And in one of these smoke-filled taverns, on a winter night so cold you could see your breath indoors, a 42-year-old woman named Gertrude Bauer sat nursing a drink she probably couldn't afford. Here's what you need to know about Gertrude. She was a hairdresser by trade, but work was inconsistent, money was scarce, and like many women in her position, she sometimes had to make impossible choices just to survive. She struggled with alcoholism, not as a moral failing, but as a way to numb the harsh reality of homelessness and desperation. Now, sitting across that tavern, watching her, was a man. Unremarkable, short, maybe 5'6", a face that had been damaged in a bicycle accident years before, his nose crooked, his eyes slightly crossed. The kind of person you'd glance at and immediately forget. His name was Fritz Honka, and he was about to commit his first murder. Here's where it gets chilling. Fritz approached Gertrude with an offer that, on that freezing December night, probably seemed like salvation. Warmth, more drinks, a place to stay until morning. No strings attached, or so he claimed. Think about that for a second. When you're cold, when you're hungry, when you've been drinking and you're facing another night in the brutal German winter, wouldn't you consider it? That's the trap. That's how predators like Fritz operated. They didn't snatch people off the street. They offered what looked like kindness to people who desperately needed it. Gertrude followed Fritz to his small apartment on Zeissstrasse. And in those early morning hours, everything changed. Now, I'm not going to sensationalize what happened next, but you need to understand the brutality to understand who Fritz really was. After hours of drinking, Fritz expected payment for his hospitality. When Gertrude resisted his demands for intimacy, he exploded. He forced himself on her. And then, perhaps because she had rejected him, perhaps because he feared she would report him, he wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled the life out of her. As daylight crept through the windows, Fritz stared at Gertrude's lifeless body on his apartment floor. And here's where...
For the next few years, Fritz spent his evenings in the dimly lit bars of Hamburg's red light district. He blended in with dock workers, drifters, and lonely souls. He was learning, observing, and he'd learned 3 critical things from Gertrude's murder. 1. Women on the margins of society were easy targets. No family asking questions, no friends filing missing person reports, no one caring. 2. Killing in his own apartment meant no screaming in public spaces, no gunshots alerting neighbors, no loud struggles that would draw attention. 3. The police weren't actively connecting dots between missing women who lived on the streets. But Fritz had one close call that should have ended everything. August 1972.
A woman named Ruth, not the Ruth who would later become his victim, but another woman, found herself in Fritz's apartment after a night of drinking. Fritz attacked her. He tried to force himself on her. But Ruth fought back. She managed to escape naked into the street. And here's the kicker. She went to the police. Fritz was actually charged with assault. Now, you're probably thinking, finally, they caught him. But here's where the system failed, catastrophically. The police didn't probe deeper. They didn't search his apartment. They didn't connect him to Gertrude's unsolved murder from 2 years earlier. They saw a drunk man, a bar fight, an assault case, and nothing more. Fritz paid his fine or served his time and walked free. And that's when he knew he was truly untouchable. Summer 1974. 2 years after that near miss with Ruth, Fritz was back in the taverns, hunting again. And his sights landed on a 54-year-old woman named Anna Bushel. Anna's story breaks my heart. She had once been a housewife. Imagine that, a normal life, a home, maybe even happiness at some point. But by 1974, she'd fallen on desperately hard times. She drifted through the same bars as Fritz, accepting money from men for favors just to survive another day. One night, in August, Fritz invited Anna back to his apartment. Both were heavily intoxicated. They'd been drinking for hours. They had intercourse, and when it was over, Fritz seethed with what he perceived as dissatisfaction.
Fritz was thinking about killing again. Her name was Frida Roblick, 57 years old. Like Anna, like Gertrude, she'd spent years on the fringes of society, turning to sex work to fund her drinking habit and simply survive. On a freezing night near Christmas, Frida accompanied Fritz home, and at some point during their encounter, Fritz discovered, or believed he discovered, that Frida had stolen money from him. According to his later confession, he'd paid her 200 Deutsche Marks for intimacy, but then he realized another 200 marks were missing from his wallet. Whether this theft was real or imagined in his drunken state, we'll never know for certain. But it didn't matter to Fritz. The perceived betrayal sent him into a fury. Once again, his hands found a throat. Once again, a woman's life ended in that small apartment. And once again, Fritz dismembered the body and carried the pieces up into the attic, where Frida's remains joined Anna's in the darkness. 2 women's bodies, hidden in an attic, and life in the building continued normally. Tenants still complained about the smell, but nothing was done. Nothing changed. Winter turned to a new year, and Fritz's appetite for violence only intensified. January 1975, barely a month after Frida's murder. Ruth Schultz was 45 years old. Her life story echoed the others, another woman who'd fallen through society's safety nets, another regular in the bars where Fritz hunted. On a bitter evening in January, Ruth made the fatal decision to go home with Fritz. They spent the night drinking, the alcohol flowing freely as it always did in these encounters. But Ruth made a mistake that would cost her everything. She mocked him. According to later testimony, Ruth laughed at Fritz's inability to perform sexually. She made fun of him. And for a man whose entire sense of self-worth was already hanging by a thread, whose masculinity was wrapped up in his ability to dominate these women, July 15, 1975, shortly after midnight. Imagine you're sleeping in your apartment. It's a warm summer night, and suddenly you smell smoke. You hear shouts. You realize the building is on fire. Residents fled into the street in their nightclothes as flames engulfed the ground floor of the apartment building. Fire crews arrived quickly, battling the blaze with water and foam. The flames were contained to the lower level, but firefighters knew their job. They had to check every floor, every space for smoldering embers that could reignite.
When they forced open the attic crawl space above the second floor, they were hit with a smell so overwhelming, so unmistakable, that even hardened first responders had to step back. The stench of decomposing human flesh, made worse by the heat of the fire below, essentially cooking the remains that had been hidden there for months. In Ruth's case, just 6 months. In Anna's case, almost a full year. The firefighters called for police immediately, and as dawn broke over Hamburg, what should have been a routine fire response transformed into one of the most shocking crime scenes in German history. Police sealed off the building and began their investigation. And suspicion quickly zeroed in on one particular tenant, Fritz Honka, the man who lived in the small flat directly below the attic, the man who was notably absent from the crowd of residents gathered outside, the man whose neighbors had been complaining about foul smells near his door for months. And here's the detail that sealed his fate. Fritz kept the only key to the attic space where the bodies were found. As the sun rose, officers sealed off the building and waited for Fritz to return. And he did. He walked right into their arms, probably expecting to hear about fire damage, maybe thinking he'd dodge questions about insurance. Instead, he was taken into custody as the sole suspect in the attic murders. At police headquarters, Fritz initially tried to maintain his innocence, but faced with overwhelming evidence, the bodies in his attic, the key only he possessed, the saw in his apartment still bearing biological material, his defenses crumbled. After several hours of questioning, Fritz broke down. He confessed to killing 3 women, but interestingly, he refused to talk about a 4th victim initially. It was only as investigators dug deeper, connecting missing person reports, or rather the lack of them, that they linked him to Gertrude Bauer's murder from 1970. By the end of July 1975, the full scope of Fritz's crimes was clear. 4 women, 5 years, all murdered.
The marriage crumbled. His wife divorced him, and after the divorce, Fritz moved into the small apartment on Zeissstrasse that would later become his killing ground. Psychologists who examined Fritz after his arrest described a man nursing an enormous hatred of women. This wasn't just garden-variety misogyny, this was deep, pathological rage. Think about Fritz's reality. He was 5'6" tall in a society that valued height in men. His face was deformed, making him an object of stares and pity. He had a speech impediment that made communication difficult. He was poor, uneducated, and socially awkward. Every romantic interaction, every sexual encounter reinforced his sense of inadequacy. And rather than addressing his own issues, Fritz externalized his rage. He blamed women for rejecting him. He saw them as the source of his humiliation. So he sought out women he perceived as lower than himself, women who were homeless, alcoholic, working in sex trade. Women who, in his twisted logic, shouldn't reject him because they had no right to standards. And when they did reject him, or when they failed to perform adequately, or when they mocked his sexual dysfunction, he killed them. When police searched Fritz's apartment, they found physical evidence of his obsession and his mindset. Adult magazines, hundreds of pinup photographs plastered on walls and ceilings. The sheer volume suggested not just interest, but obsession. This was a man who had constructed a fantasy world around the sexual possession and domination of women. They found the saw he'd used to dismember his victims. They found biological evidence linking him to all 4 murders. And they found the air fresheners, dozens and dozens of them, his desperate attempt to mask the smell of death. The autopsy reports on the victims revealed the extent of Fritz's rage. I'm not going to dwell on the graphic details out of respect for these women, but you need to understand that Fritz didn't just kill, he desecrated. He mutilated post-mortem in ways that went far beyond the practical need to conceal evidence. Ruth Schultz's body showed particularly extensive mutilation. Both legs sawn off at the thigh, both breasts removed, ears cut away, the tip of her nose sliced off, her tongue cut out. This wasn't just about hiding a crime, this was about expressing rage at the female form itself. The trial of Fritz Honka began in Hamburg in November 1976. Spectators packed the courtroom, reporters crowded the gallery. Everyone wanted to see the man accused of such unspeakable crimes. What would he look like? Would he show remorse? Would he seem like a monster? And what they saw was ordinary, small, meek, the kind of man you'd overlook in a crowd. Fritz's defense team didn't dispute that he had caused these women's deaths. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, their strategy focused on saving him from full murder convictions by emphasizing his impaired mental state. Interestingly, Fritz had recanted his earlier confessions. Now he claimed to have absolutely no memory of murdering these women. He insisted he'd been blackout drunk, that these acts occurred in alcoholic fugues he couldn't recall. Psychiatric experts were called to testify. They painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man, plagued by feelings of
Maybe Fritz Honka was finally being haunted by what he'd done. On October 19, 1998, Fritz died in a Hamburg hospital. He was 63 years old, and for most people, that would be the end of the story. But it's not, because this story was never really about Fritz Honka. For decades, nearly 50 years, the 4 women Fritz murdered remained in the shadow of his infamy. True crime media focused on the killer. Books were written about Fritz's psychology. Films dramatized his crimes. His name became known, discussed, analyzed. But what about Gertrude Bauer? What about Anna Buchel, Frieda Roblick, Ruth Schultz? Their names were rarely spoken, their lives rarely acknowledged beyond being victims or statistics. They became footnotes in Fritz Honka's story, rather than being recognized as people with their own stories, their own struggles, their own humanity. In May 2025, just months ago, the city of Hamburg finally sought to correct this historical oversight. A memorial stone was unveiled in a cemetery bearing 4 names engraved in stone. Not victims of Fritz Honka, not murdered women, just their names, their identities, their existence acknowledged and remembered. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about society, then and now. Fritz Honka didn't kill 4 random women. He specifically targeted women who existed on the margins. Women struggling with addiction, women working in sex trade, women without stable homes or strong social networks, women whose disappearances wouldn't be noticed, wouldn't be reported, wouldn't matter. And he was right. For years, he was absolutely right. No one looked for these women. No one filed missing person reports. No one demanded answers. That should horrify us. Not just what Fritz did, but the system that allowed him to do it. The society that created categories of people who could simply vanish without anyone caring. Here's the question that should keep you up at night. How many Fritz Honkas are out there right now? How many predators have learned the same lesson, that certain people can disappear without consequence? How many vulnerable women, men, and children are missing right now, their absences unnoticed because society has deemed them invisible? Fritz Honka isn't an aberration, he's a symptom of a society that creates hierarchies of whose life matters and whose doesn't. The memorial stone in Hamburg bearing 4 names isn't just about the past, it's about now. It's a reminder that every person, regardless of their struggles, their addictions, their circumstances, deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be remembered. Gertrude Bauer was a hairdresser who fell on hard times. Anna Buchel was once a housewife with hopes and dreams. Frieda Roblick was a woman trying to survive in an unkind world. Ruth Schultz was someone's daughter, someone who laughed and cried and lived.
They weren't just victims, they were people, and now, finally, their names are etched in stone, ensuring they won't be lost to memory. Remember them, remember their names, and remember that in cities around the world right now, there are people on the margins, people struggling, people vulnerable. They deserve our attention, they deserve our care, they deserve to be seen. Because if we don't see them, predators will.